Lisa Palmer is a journalist and a resident fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. She's also a former Wilson Public Policy scholar and the author of this book, Hot, Hungry Planet. Lisa, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
So the subtitle, The Fight to Stop a Global Food Crisis in the Face of Climate Change. And you write in the book in the early pages that we're on the cusp of a global food crisis. Can you define what that means?
Well, I think it's something right now we need to think about a little bit of history. So when over time, for a long period of our time on this planet, humans have been a fairly small proportion of this global planet. And we were at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, there were 1 billion of us. Right? Now there are over 7 billion people on the planet, and that's hurtling towards 9 to 10 billion people on this planet by the middle of the century. That's only a few decades from now. And so how we're going to provide food for these extra 2 billion people sustainably, having enough food for everybody, enough water, enough clean water, and energy for everybody will be a big challenge.
And then ladled on top of that, the climate is changing, and which changes crops and fishing and all kinds of things. Could you connect those dots for us?
Well, the way that the climate is changing is different around the world. And the achieving this global food security amid this changing environment is a complex problem that we don't really know how to solve yet. And that's really some of the points in the book, is that we want to integrate some of the knowledge that we have, but it's a call for greater action. I think right now we have these 2 billion people roiled by climate change, and the challenge is at such a great scale, and that it's going to take governments, academia, business, and ordinary people to step up and have the will to want to solve the problem.
You tell stories of things that are happening. Among those, what do you find most hopeful as far as the people actually paying attention and coming up with sustainable ideas?
Well, I think, farmers around the world, we'll start there, are great experimenters. If it works, they'll do it. And if it makes good business sense, they're businessmen or women, they'll do it. And so I met with many people who are trying to work together in new ways and try new things. So I visited India, and I met with a variety of people. And one thing particularly comes to mind, because in an area, this area had depletion of groundwater, and this farmer really was looking to find new ways to irrigate his field. But the government is like, well, let's try to see if we can be more, conserve more water. And so they helped him he made investments, but they helped him produce actually I think he teamed up with 6 other people to install solar irrigation. And so they were
What is solar irrigation?
So solar powered irrigation to pump groundwater to irrigate when they didn't have the rains. And so, but rather than pumping massive amounts of water, he's able to sell back some of that power to the grid so that it equals a crop. So he's able to financially get some financial ways to conserve water, as well as providing just enough water to grow his crop, but not too much.
When you're looking at the landscape and trying to define the problem, when you look at something, say, like the current famine in Somalia, how do you know if that's part of this trend versus it being an anomaly, or does it even matter?
Well, there are people that measure, the gradients of food security. There are several measures of it, and it's a gradient. I think that, one of the things we know is that food security and it will be affected by climate change, because climate change ultimately means water change. We have rains that are coming at the wrong time, or large amounts of it in just a couple of days, and then long stretches without water. And so, being able to adapt and change that and become more resilient to those kinds of systems will take some time, but it definitely will also take people off guard without the resources and, the policies to help provide some levels of resilience for them.
Yeah, you mentioned India, I mentioned Somalia. We tend to think of these problems as distant. Within the United States, are there areas that are changing that will have an impact on food production?
Well, California is the most recent example. They had a 4-year drought, and they realized, that they have to make some policy changes. Agriculture is a significant consumer of water there, and as well as agriculture is a main producer of for their economy, and so they have to ride that edge. But what we have in the U.S. are safety nets, and they're different around. Will we be able to sustain these safety nets for farmers and for price supporting? In the future, if we have many piled on climate events, we don't know.
The impact of some of these changes are happening now, so we don't have to talk about them as in the future. But when we talk in terms of a crisis, what is the time frame for that, where this could be an acknowledged global crisis?
They have there's a range of time frames. Anytime between 2030, 2050, where I'm seeing different ranges of time frame, and where we have changes in production. I see of decreasing production by 8 to 23% in some places. That's a wide range, and it's really dependent upon where the crops are grown and how much other types of mitigating factors that they can use to help to either plant a more drought tolerant product or plant something that, for instance, I learned about rice, snorkel. They were calling it snorkel rice, like rice that could survive many, many years of inundation, or I'm sorry, many, many weeks of inundation and still survive and grow. So that we've seen these big floods. And
so a resilient form of rice. Wow. So when you travel the globe and when you see what's happening in the trenches, your sense of this, what is seen as often a political debate in this country about not even agreeing to what the problem is or the nature of the problem is that changing, or has that changed to a point now where the train's left the station? Yeah, the train's left the station. I mean, I was talking to farmers in their 60s, right? And these are the people that are actively trying to find innovations that they can adopt because they care about what the future is like for their families that will inherit their farms. They've also lived in many places that I've talked to. They've lived through famines. They've lived through times of great scarcity. They want to do what their best is to make it a better life for their families in the future. And so they see it happening. They don't necessarily want to call it climate change, but they see that they've had an entire season of rain fall in the course of 3 days. And they need to be able to handle it. Yeah. And they were able to try some cropping systems that worked. Another thought in that regard is the challenges that you describe and challenges beyond what you describe versus the level of global activity to address those challenges, whether it be more sustainable approaches to crops or these new technologies like the solar irrigation. Is the level of activity to address the problems up to the level necessary to address the scope of the problem? There's a mismatch there, for sure. There really is, but I'm seeing a trend, and I'm very hopeful. I heard news that there's some of our land grant universities are now taking this on in the United States as a great global challenge to join forces with academia and business, as this is a matter of national security as well, because this is a great problem, and the solution isn't the same everywhere. It's right. Crops are different, and the problem manifests differently. Exactly, and so by looking through this with multiple lenses, that will be key. And I think that we're now beginning to do that. But just thinking about breeding one new type of seed or a new type of crop, it takes pretty much 10 years from the start to finish of getting it from the test from the bench in breeding at a breeding site into the field. And so, that's a long time, and we don't have a lot of time to do that. I want to ask you a process question beyond the subject matter. Yes. We talked a bit before we began recording about the transition from being a journalist who does mostly short form to writing a book. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about what that experience was like and what it took for you to adjust your way of approaching a story to write a book versus writing an article. Well, first of all, when I started thinking about writing this book, I realized I needed to stay on a subject for a long period of time. And I had been covering climate change over quite a few number of years and started to do more reporting on agriculture. And I thought the two had, to get put together, I would have a lot to say, especially also because I grew up in Minnesota in an agricultural area. And so I could draw from my experiences as well as my knowledge of what, really life as a farmer is like.
But as a journalist, I'm also a runner. And so, I think of it as, running a lap around the track, being a journalist as the 400 or, the 400 meters of a race versus doing the, New York
to
Marathon.
increase your stamina.
Exactly. The time in the seat was part of it.
Well, and you got some of that here at the Wilson Center during your fellowship.
Yes.
Well, Lisa, congratulations again. Thanks for joining us today. Lisa Palmer is the author. Hot Hungry Planet is the book.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Nice
you.
to be here.
Pleasure.
All right.